Hello, guys. My name is Dunya, and welcome to the Reader Circle podcast, where we discuss all things literary in celebration of our 38th podcast in the series. Today's episode will be a bit longer than usual
That's right. My name is Tamia, and on today's podcast, we're doing something very exciting by focusing on a topic closer to home.
and relevant. With women's issues being in the limelight in the media, we're so pleased to introduce the impact of women on of literature on women's history in terms of America's literary scene, with a special focus on the wonderful city of Houston, of course. Though formal literature did not exist during early history, especially in the Houston area, we found little information that links some early forms of literature to that area.
But we should start at the beginning. There were only two kinds of narratives before 1491. Before 1491, written sources were scarce, and those that did exist were often men's accounts of exploration. The first is local Native American myths, and the second is colonist descriptions of the mysterious new land they found.
One of those is definitely easier to find than the other, so let's start with that one. Colonists' description of the mysterious new land they found. Alvar Nunes Cabeza de Vaca is already a big name in U.S. history, and for very good reason. Though he primarily explored Latin America, he also visited various parts of what we now call Texas, and more importantly, he wrote about the land and native people he came across, even though they weren't all in the best interactions.
One thing that came up over and over again is that the Cabeza de Vaca didn't see Native American women as feminine. They did what he described as hard work that was outside the home, even if that work centered it. Because it wasn't what European women did, it was inferior and foreign. This, along with the perceived lack of modesty, was used to justify white settlers' mistreatment.
That's exactly right. Between those different social roles and perceived lack of modesty, femininity just didn't look the same. While it wasn't the only reason later settlers felt justified in the atrocities they would later commit, it was a major contributing factor. Social roles have been an important factor in daily lives throughout history, even before the establishment of the United States and eventually Houston, Texas.
Though indigenous women were just a footnote in journal entries, they could be very influential, which brings us to a more complicated side of the story: Native American women's accounts.
Yeah, this is where things start getting tough to research and track down. Unfortunately, majority of Native American account stories did not survive colonization. Many communities were displaced with their languages and traditions pushed out. Many of their oral histories weren't even written down by outsiders, making it almost impossible to know those women's stories. In fact, the tribes that originally inhabited Houston were thought to be extinct until recently. The few stories we do have are very fragmented and pulled out of their original context. Most times, it's a paragraph or a retelling of a story from an outside perspective.
Like that one creation myth we found.
Right, the coalition called the story Napaco. It's the story of humanity being led out of the spirit world and into the living world. One. The moon, a stag, and an eagle all help their ascent to where Mother Earth called for them. Both the moon and earth are represented as women and gave humanity physical forms. Though they didn't create the spirit of humanity, they helped humans manifest into something tangible that could influence their environment. They have a definite role as creators, but they aren't particularly maternal by modern American standards.
Is that all?
Like I said, we don't have the whole lot specific stories. The lack of first-hand account is even more obvious when looking at other parts of the world. Italian thinker Laura Coretta, for example, is famous for her letters. We can easily reference her thoughts on women, sexism, and society between 1485 and 1488. That specifically is something that we often can't get with Native American perspectives from the same time period. But even with all that, they are just as important and deserve a larger conversation that we will be talking about later today. Be sure to subscribe and get a notification about next week's podcast, episode episode 39, The Scarce Accounts of Indigenous Women.
Though the stories themselves are scarce, you'll see a tradition of women expressing themselves through poetry in Mesoamerica, not extremely far from what will become the now Houston area. Women made their voices heard through poetry throughout the Aztec and Nua world, a tradition that has persisted into the modern day. Aztec and Nua poets are particularly well renowned, beginning a tradition that continues into the present day. One Aztec woman, Maquilxochitl, made a name for herself, and her works are still studied. This gives us historical context that may point towards poetry as one of the first forms of literary expression used by women in prehistory.
Oh yeah, she's a perfect example. She was in a very unique position in society. Fun fact, she was one of 12 children born to a very respected advisor. Her family background gave her access to education that most women at the time didn't have. She was also more aware of political and military issues than other women. While Native American women had a different limitation than European women, they were sometimes excluded from political participation during this time. They still had limits.
That's right, her father was known as the conqueror of the world by his contemporaries. That would make her a more respected woman, like you said, giving her more access than other women had to certain information, and I would assume better treatment.
Wow, that's some serious stuff. She sure is a historical figure if I've ever heard of one.
Oh, yeah, she was deeply familiar with the realities of conquest. One of her most famous poems describes a military campaign in vivid details. It was very striking because it shows how gender roles operate in her culture. She was provided with access to political and military knowledge that most European women in the same area wouldn't have been exposed to. If you compare her work to the writings of women in later colonial times, you'll see a drastic difference. In Europe, women weren't allowed to speak publicly on political matters until Elizabeth Barton started pushing boundaries in 1526.
And it's probably safe to assume America wasn't any more advanced in women's rights.
Nope. Many women simply wouldn't have had the same opportunity or social permission to even write about warfare, showcasing the limitations placed on women's expression during this period due to gender norms.
I'm glad you brought that up because I think it's about time to move on to the colonial era. When you think of American settlers, you usually picture hardship, near constant work, and very heavy focus on the church.
Right.
Well, life in early colonial America was tough to be sure, but no one can spend all their time farming and praying. While literature was more available from 1492 to 1750 than prehistory, women were not the main contributors or audience of these because of the limited education for women, societal restrictions, and the patriarchy. Much like the Aztec and Nahua women from prehistory to 1491, women during 1492 to 1750 used poetry as an outlet. Anne Bradstreet is an excellent example of a female poet who challenged societal norms. She is most well known for writing how much she loved her husband and moments in their marriage. Life in colonial America was so strict that when Anne Bradstreet started writing love poems, men were shocked. Like, wait, women can write and talk about love?
That's hilarious. Young love.
And subversive too. In the 1670s, when she was writing, a lot of religious leaders viewed love as inherently sinful. Her poems, though, treated love as something pure, often drawing direct allusions to the Bible itself. Listen to this line from one of her poems. Compare with me, ye women, if you can. I prize thy love more than whole mines of gold, or all the riches that the East doth hold. She is so proud of her love, even though she's been told it's something to be ashamed of. Anne Bradstreet used literature to defy and eventually change the social norms. Her rebellions against literary canon may have seemed small then, but they paved the way for women after her to be more transgressive.
And that's especially interesting when you compare it to the work of her contemporaries, like Catherine Phillips, who was writing around the same time in England rather than America.
Did she write about love too?
Sometimes, but she was better known for other things. She did a lot, actually, but as far as poetry is concerned, her most famous work centered around female friendships over romantic love. She used a lot of literary conventions and language associated with romance to convey the deep importance of these friendships while also stressing equality in a way most romantic poems did not. In this way, she centered women in a lot of her work. However, her subject matter very much fit the literary canon at the time.
So America was innovating from the beginning.
Well, at the time it didn't seem like much, but America eventually became a symbol of that sort of rebellion.
And speaking of rebellion, women had an important role in the American Revolution as well. Literary salons began springing up in Philadelphia where women could share their thoughts in these spaces, women could disagree with their husbands, and have their idea respected as much as any other man.
While still not speaking publicly about politics, women were beginning to make their thoughts known in more palatable forms, and women only get more outspoken from there. I hope you don't mind if I jump into the 1800s.
Yeah, let's get started. My favorite period to talk about.
Reflecting on the ideas of feminism, the women's movement in the 19th century challenged social norms after women began becoming aware of the dangers of patriarchy.
That's right. During this time, women fought against social and economic discrimination, where their lives were expected to consist of motherhood, marriage, and spinsterhood. Thanks to literature, new images of womanhood were promoted through various books, and these books impacted young girls and women to stray away from their obedient role in society, demonstrating how women's movements literature influenced women to fight against traditional roles in society, giving them given to them by family, churches, schools, and literature.
I have a great example of that. Fanny Wright's work is well worth it. Her book, Views of Society and Manners in America, covered a lot of ground, including class, gender, and even slavery. Though published in the early 1800s, her ideas were shockingly progressive and wildly unpopular. As a European woman who opposed slavery, defended the poor, and encouraged women's expressions of sensuality, she viewed America as an egalitarian paradise. America wasn't quite what she made it out to be, but her points were still taken seriously by both fans and critics. She was quickly branded a radical, which is just about the worst insult a public figure could receive. She got the last laugh, though. Her ideas were later a foundational part of Americans' women's rights. In fact, we linked the Declaration of Sentiments in the description so listeners could check out the similarities for themselves.
But if you don't want to do all that, we don't blame you. In a lot of ways, Wright was more progressive than ever, even the suffragists. Female sexuality wasn't even a question in Seneca Falls, but their insistence on legal and social equality, she would have been all for that.
Earlier, when we talked about Anne Bradstreet, it reminded me of a letter I saw from Margaret Lee Houston, the First Lady of the Republic of Texas for a couple years in the 1800s. While researching, I found that she was similar to Anne Bradstreet. While Anne Bradstreet had poems of her love for her spouse, I found that a letter of Margaret expressing her love to her husband in a heartfelt letter. It's crazy how feminine expressions were looked down upon so heavily then, but sort of became normal, as time went on.
And that just shows how women's expression was suppressed the further we go back in history. It's been on my mind too. We should probably get back on track.
Right. Sorry, it was just nice to break away from poetry for a bit.
It was almost starting to seem like poetry was the only thing women contributed to.
Yeah, that's what makes this research so important. I didn't know much about any of this before we started researching for this episode. So far, I've learned that literature in just about any form has been a huge tool for women to express themselves during times in history where they were expected to submit to societal expectations.
As long as we're talking about women's history, I think I have a good story to talk about. The advancement of women's expressions later in history.
All right, let's hear it.
We've talked about women in US history, but we haven't talked about Black women and their contributions to literature use yet. Most feminists before 1877, and after that as well, were wealthy white women. While abolitionists and feminists had a lot overlapping members, the causes weren't explicitly linked. Enter Sojourner Truth, a formerly enslaved woman from the North.
Hey, I've heard of her.
I'm sure everyone has. Her story is probably the most widely taught out of anyone on this list. Even if the name doesn't ring a bell, you're probably familiar with her Ain't I a Woman speech. As a Black woman, her experience was very different from any of the leaders of the women's rights movement. Racism and misogyny both impacted how she was treated and how she wanted the movement to reflect that. In her speech, she demands to be seen as a woman just like any other. Many see her ideas as the beginnings of intersectionality, or the theory that people in multiple marginalized groups experience oppression in a very unique way.
I always thought intersectionality was a newer idea. The concept that overlapping social identities can lead to severely more oppression than individual identities is insane and very prevalent in history. In my English class last week, my professor talked about feminism, and we read accounts from individuals that experienced intersectionality due to having multiple social identities. typically as being part of a minority. I concluded that the lesson encouraged urgency in dismantling patriarchy and inequalities in the treatment of minorities, which is exactly what women like Sojourner Truth fought for. She highlighted how her experience as a black woman differed from wealthy white women in a way that the world couldn't ignore. Actually, I used to think intersectionality was a modern idea. Turns out Sojourner Truth had already figured it out way before most of us even figured out group projects.
That was a good one. Now, the term intersectionality is a modern, but Sojourner Truth was already describing in 1851. Good for her, honestly. That's just another example of the early fight for women's rights in history. Overall, Sojourner's Truth's speech challenges social norms for Black women at the time, proving once again that literature was a valuable tool for women to express themselves.
I learned so much from this conversation. I'm confident in saying that literature has been instrumental for women expressing their individuality and for challenging social norms throughout history. Women of the 19th century were the ones to shatter tough barriers surrounding feminism and created various opportunities for those coming after them. Many of these influential women were early Texans who fought for self expression, with my favorite being Emily Austin Bryan Perry, who we will discuss later in a future episode, of course.
Not to mention that some of the earliest forms of women's self-expression can be traced to Latin America, not far from what we know now as Houston, Texas.
Right, I have a question for you if you think you can answer it.
Of course I can answer it. I'm basically a pro now.
In your opinion, what period from our research is the most effective in potentially proving that literature was a valuable way for women to express themselves?
That's a hard question. Personally, I think that prehistory to 1491 is most effective in possibly proving our claim because it was a time with less technology and resources, and yet women still found ways to express their feelings on societal norms during that time. We focused on women's narratives for obvious reasons, but men also used poetry to discuss women's roles in history. Aztec ruler Nezahualcóyotl created various poems mentioning things like "Let your hearts know, O princes, O eagles and jaguars," which can allude to emotion in relationships between men and women. Over time, women have advanced in using literature for expression, as so have men in describing women's roles in society in early history.
It's crazy that even today, literature is still used to express ourselves. But we won't get into modern day in today's episode. Today's focus was all about literature as a tool for women's expression.
Unfortunately, I think that's where we'll leave things off for today. Thanks for tuning into the Reader Circle, and like we said earlier, be sure to subscribe and notified about future podcasts all about literature culture. Just remember to stay curious and read or write or be a poet. Wink, wink.
Funny joke. Bye, everyone. See you next episode.